The January sun hammered down on the northern coast of Guadalcanal, transforming the dense jungle canopy into a suffocating greenhouse of rotting vegetation and stagnant water. It was the 22nd day of January 1943, and the American campaign in the Solomon Islands had devolved into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. West of Point Cruz, the landscape was a shattered nightmare of pulverized coral, splintered mahogany trees, and muddy ravines stinking of unburied bodies and spent cordite. The men of the 132nd Infantry Regiment, part of the Americal Division, were exhausted beyond the limits of human endurance. They had been thrust into this tropical hell to relieve the battered 1st Marine Division and immediately found themselves locked in a savage stalemate against the deeply entrenched soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army. The environment itself was as lethal as the enemy. Malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot decimated the American ranks, pulling more men off the line than enemy bullets. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on the soldiers who lay shivering with fever in waterlogged foxholes. But for the past 72 hours, a far more acute and terrifying threat had paralyzed the American advance in the groves west of Point Cruz. Japanese snipers, invisible phantoms hidden within the dense foliage, had established absolute dominance over the battlefield. In just 3 days, 14 American soldiers had been killed by single, meticulously placed shots that offered no warning and left no trace of the shooter's location. The psychological toll of this invisible terror was catastrophic. An infantryman can brace himself for an artillery barrage or return fire against a visible machine gun nest, but the sniper introduces a profound, creeping dread that shatters unit cohesion. The Japanese Imperial Army had perfected the art of the hidden marksman. They utilized the Arisaka Type 97 sniper rifle, a weapon specifically designed for jungle warfare. Firing a 6.5mm cartridge, the Arisaka produced minimal muzzle flash and virtually no smoke. Furthermore, the Japanese snipers were masters of camouflage. They did not simply hide behind trees, they became part of the jungle. They strapped themselves into the highest branches of massive banyan trees, wrapping their bodies and weapons in palm fronds and woven vines. Alternatively, they dug deep subterranean spider holes, covering the entrances with trapdoors made of living earth and vegetation. They would wait for hours or even days, completely motionless, subsisting on tiny rations of rice and rainwater, waiting for an American officer or radio operator to present a target. When they fired, the sound of the gunshot was swallowed by the dense acoustic dampening of the jungle, leaving the surviving Americans completely disoriented, firing blindly into the green wall of leaves in a desperate and futile attempt to suppress an enemy they could not see. The standard military doctrine of the United States Army at that time emphasized volume of fire over precision marksmanship. The primary infantry weapon was the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic marvel of engineering that gave the American squad unparalleled fire superiority. The prevailing theory among battalion commanders was that any enemy position could be neutralized by overwhelming it with 30-caliber armor-piercing rounds. But the groves of Point Cruz proved this doctrine completely ineffective against a disciplined, concealed sniper. You cannot suppress what you cannot locate. The commanding officers of the 132nd Infantry Regiment were frantic. Their men were pinned down, morale was collapsing, and the advance had halted. They ordered heavy mortar barrages and intense machine gun fire into the tree lines, but the Japanese snipers simply waited out the bombardments deep in their spider holes or securely lashed to the high branches where the shrapnel could not reach them. Once the bombardment lifted, the single fatal shots would resume. It was into this desperate, paralyzed environment that 2nd Lieutenant John George stepped forward with a proposition that defied every military regulation and invited the open mockery of his superior officers. John George was not an average infantry officer. Long before he found himself swatting away malarial mosquitoes in the Solomon Islands, he had been a prodigy of civilian marksmanship. He was the youngest man to ever win the Illinois State Champion Marksman title. George possessed an intrinsic understanding of ballistics, windage, elevation, and the complex mathematics of bullet trajectory. He knew that the standard-issue military rifles were fundamentally unsuited for the precise surgical task of counter-sniping. The M1 Garand, for all its rapid-fire glory, lacked the inherent mechanical accuracy required to hit a human head at 300 yards under combat stress. Even the military-issue sniper rifle, the Springfield M1903A4, was hampered by mass production tolerances and inferior optics. George knew that to hunt a ghost, he needed an instrument of absolute, uncompromising precision. He had anticipated this need months earlier and had made a decision that baffled his peers. Using 2 full years of his saved National Guard pay, he had purchased a civilian sporting rifle from a mail-order catalog and smuggled it into the combat theater. The weapon George brought to the war was a Winchester Model 70 bolt-action hunting rifle. In the civilian world, the Model 70 was revered as the rifleman's rifle, a masterpiece of American gunsmithing. It featured a Mauser-style controlled round feed mechanism, a massive steel extractor that gripped the cartridge case with unbreakable reliability, ensuring that the weapon would not jam even when choked with mud and grit. The barrel was hammer-forged from ordnance steel crafted with microscopic tolerances that no military assembly line could replicate. The trigger mechanism broke with the crisp, clean snap of a glass rod, absolutely essential for preventing the microscopic muzzle flinch that ruins long-range accuracy. But perhaps the most crucial component of George's mail-order setup was the optic. He had mounted a Lyman Alaskan 2.5-power telescopic sight. Unlike the fragile narrow field scopes issued by the military, the Lyman Alaskan featured brilliant light-gathering lenses that allowed the shooter to peer into the dark shadowed recesses of the jungle canopy. It was a weapon designed to take down elk and bighorn sheep across the sweeping valleys of the American West, but George knew it was the perfect tool to kill the men who were murdering his soldiers. When George first presented his weapon to his commanding officers, the reaction was a mixture of disbelief and outright derision. Captain Morris, a hardened infantry officer who believed entirely in the doctrine of overwhelming firepower, took one look at the polished walnut stock and blued steel of the Winchester and dismissed it as a toy. He ordered George to leave his mail-order sweetheart in his tent and pick up a real military weapon. Other platoon leaders laughed at the young lieutenant, telling him that a deer hunting rifle had absolutely no place in the mechanized brutality of modern global warfare. They argued that a bolt-action rifle firing at a fraction of the speed of a Garand was a death sentence in a close-quarters jungle fight. They failed to understand that George had no intention of fighting a close-quarter battle. He intended to fight a war of mathematics, patience, and optics. He ignored the mockery, defied the informal orders of his captain, and carried the heavy Winchester into the shattered ruins of a Japanese bunker on the morning of January 22. The physical demands of counter-sniping are profoundly different from regular infantry combat. George did not charge forward with his bayonet fixed. Instead, he crept into the pulverized coral and rotting logs, moving inches at a time to avoid disturbing the foliage. Once he found a suitable hide, he simply stopped moving. In the equatorial heat of Guadalcanal, remaining perfectly still is a form of physical torture. Sweat poured into his eyes, stinging his vision. Jungle ants and mosquitoes swarmed over his exposed skin, biting relentlessly. To flinch or swat at an insect was to risk exposing his position to the enemy snipers who were scanning the brush for any sign of movement. George had to control his breathing, slow his heart rate, and detach his mind from the agonizing discomfort of his own body. He pressed his eye to the Lyman Alaskan scope and began the agonizingly slow process of dissecting the jungle wall in front of him. He did not look for a man. He looked for anomalies. A cluster of leaves that did not match the surrounding species. A shadow that appeared too geometric. A slight unnerving stillness in a branch while the rest of the tree swayed in the ocean breeze. The Japanese snipers were patient, but George was hunting with a weapon that allowed him to strike from distances they considered safe. The first engagement validated everything George believed about precision marksmanship. He observed a tiny, unnatural shift in the upper canopy of a massive banyan tree nearly 300 yards away. Through the brilliant optics of the Lyman scope, he isolated the outline of a Japanese sniper clad in green netting waiting for an American target. George calculated the distance, mentally adjusting for the slight crosswind coming off the waters of Iron Bottom Sound. He pushed the heavy safety lever of the Winchester forward, wrapping his finger around the trigger. He exhaled a long, slow breath, pausing at the bottom of his respiratory cycle to completely steady his chest. The trigger broke cleanly. The heavy .30 caliber bullet erupted from the muzzle, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The kinetic energy of the hunting round struck the sniper, instantly terminating the threat. The enemy soldier tumbled from the high branches, crashing through the canopy and hitting the jungle floor. One shot, one kill. The mockery from the battalion officers ceased almost immediately. Over the next 4 days, the groves west of Point Cruz transformed from an American slaughterhouse into John George's personal hunting ground. He employed advanced counter-sniper tactics that would not be formally written into military doctrine for another 2 decades. He studied the angle of impact on the helmets and bodies of the slain Americans, using rudimentary geometry to trace the bullet trajectories back to their origin points. He used decoy helmets propped up on sticks waiting for the Japanese snipers to reveal their positions with a muzzle flash. When they fired, George was already dialed and executing them with terrifying mechanical precision. His bolt-action rifle was indeed slower than the Garand, but speed was irrelevant. The Japanese snipers never knew they were being hunted until the heavy hunting bullets shattered their skulls or pierced their chests. The civilian Winchester proved utterly devastating. In 96 hours of grueling, agonizingly slow combat, John George eliminated 11 confirmed Japanese snipers, single-handedly breaking the invisible siege that had paralyzed an entire infantry regiment. The implications of what George achieved over those 4 days rippled outward, changing the fundamental tactical understanding of the Pacific Campaign. Battalion commanders who had previously worshipped the concept of fire superiority were forced to confront a new reality. In the complex, heavily vegetated terrain of the Pacific Islands, a single highly trained man with a weapon of supreme mechanical accuracy was vastly more effective at neutralizing point targets than an entire company firing blindly. The officers who had laughed at his mail-order rifle were forced to eat their words, as George's unofficial innovation undoubtedly saved the lives of hundreds, perhaps thousands of American soldiers who would have otherwise walked blindly into the crosshairs of the Imperial snipers. George's actions provided a blueprint for the formalization of the American Scout Sniper program. It proved that the military needed specialized weapons specifically designed for extreme accuracy, not just mass-produced infantry rifles pulled from the assembly line. To fully understand the magnitude of this achievement, one must delve deeper into the mechanical reality of the weapons and the harsh environment of Guadalcanal. The .30-06 Springfield cartridge fired by the Winchester Model 70 is a massive, powerful piece of ammunition. Developed early in the 20th century, it fires a heavy lead-core bullet jacketed in copper, generating over 2,800 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. When that projectile strikes a human target, it does not merely puncture, it creates a massive temporary wound cavity hydrostatic shock that destroys internal organs and shatters bone. The Japanese 6.5mm round, while accurate, lacked this devastating stopping power, often requiring multiple hits to kill a man unless it struck the head or heart. George was hitting his targets with a sledgehammer from a distance where they believed they were untouchable. Furthermore, the bolt-action mechanism of the Winchester, though requiring manual operation for each shot, offered a distinct advantage over semi-automatic weapons in the sniper role. The M1 Garand utilized a gas system that violently ejected the spent casing immediately upon firing, throwing hot brass into the air and creating an audible metallic clatter that could betray a sniper's position. The Winchester allowed George to manually and silently extract the spent casing, preserving his concealment after the shot was taken. The weather on Guadalcanal was also a major factor in the ballistics of the sniper duel. The extreme humidity and heat of the jungle environment significantly affected bullet flight. High temperatures increase the velocity of the bullet as the powder burns more efficiently, while the dense, humid air creates more drag on the projectile. A standard infantryman with open iron sights would never notice these microscopic variations, but for a sniper attempting a headshot at 300 yards, these environmental factors require constant mental calculation. George had to constantly adjust his aim, compensating for the barometric pressure, the humidity, and the shifting coastal winds. The Lyman Alaskan scope with its fine crosshairs allowed him to make these minute adjustments, aiming inches above or to the side of his target to ensure the bullet dropped exactly where he intended. The Japanese snipers, utilizing the inferior optics of their Arisaka rifles, could not match this level of sophisticated ballistic calculation at extreme ranges. The battle for Point Cruz was a microcosm of the entire Guadalcanal campaign, a brutal, unyielding clash of wills where human endurance was pushed past the breaking point. The Japanese forces commanded by General Hirokichi Hyakutake were slowly starving. The American naval blockade had effectively severed their supply lines, leaving the Imperial soldiers to fight on desperately reduced rations. They were weak, sick, and isolated, but their discipline and fanatical devotion to the Emperor made them incredibly dangerous opponents. They knew they could not win a conventional firefight against the heavily supplied American forces, so they resorted to asymmetric warfare, utilizing the jungle to bleed the Americans dry. The sniper was the ultimate weapon of this asymmetric strategy. A single man with a rifle and a handful of rice could halt the advance of an entire battalion, force the deployment of massive artillery resources, and completely shatter the psychological resolve of the enemy troops. When John George systematically dismantled this sniper network, he did more than just kill 11 enemy soldiers. He restored the offensive momentum of the 132nd Infantry. By eliminating the snipers, he allowed the American patrols to move freely through the jungle to map the Japanese defensive positions and to coordinate accurate artillery fire on the enemy bunkers. The infantrymen who had been cowering in their foxholes, terrified of the invisible death from the trees, watched as the young lieutenant carried out his grim solitary work. The psychological relief experienced by the American troops was immense. The ghost had been busted. The impenetrable jungle was no longer an absolute sanctuary for the enemy. The men realized that they had a protector, a guardian angel who possessed the skill and the weapon to strike back at the invisible killers. The morale of the American division surged and the slow, grueling advance toward the western end of the island resumed. The story of the mail-order rifle is a testament to the power of individual initiative in the rigid hierarchical structure of the military. The Army is a massive bureaucracy built on standardization, uniformity, and strict adherence to established doctrine. Innovation within such a system is often met with resistance, suspicion, and mockery, as John George experienced from his commanding officers. But warfare is an unforgiving proving ground that ultimately rewards effectiveness over tradition. George recognized a fatal flaw in the standard operating procedure, and he possessed the courage to challenge the conventional wisdom. He bypassed the enormous logistical apparatus of the War Department, simply opening a catalog and purchasing the tool he knew he needed. This act of civilian procurement, born of frustration and a deep understanding of his craft, circumvented years of bureaucratic red tape and military testing protocols. He brought a piece of sporting Americana to a foreign jungle and proved that sometimes the most advanced military technology is a beautifully crafted hunting rifle in the hands of a master marksman. The legacy of the Winchester Model 70 in military service did not end in the groves of Point Cruz. The profound success of John George's unofficial experiment eventually penetrated the thick skulls of the Military Ordnance Department. While the Army continued to rely heavily on modified infantry rifles for sniper duty, the United States Marine Corps took careful note of the extreme precision offered by the heavy-barreled civilian bolt-action. Decades later, during the Vietnam War, the Winchester Model 70 would return to the jungle, this time as the officially sanctioned weapon of Marine Corps scout snipers. Legendary marksmen like Carlos Hathcock would use the very same Mauser-style action and heavy barrel configuration to achieve confirmed kills at staggering distances, cementing the rifle's reputation as one of the most lethal precision instruments ever deployed in combat. The foundation for that legendary status was laid on Guadalcanal by a young lieutenant who refused to listen to officers who understood firepower but knew absolutely nothing about the solitary, silent art of the sniper. The details of those 4 days in January 1943 offer a harrowing glimpse into the reality of close-quarters jungle warfare. It was a combat environment devoid of romance or glory, characterized by filth, disease, and the constant terrifying anticipation of sudden death. George's physical condition during the hunt would have been appalling. His uniform would have been rotting off his body, permanently soaked in sweat and muddy water. His skin covered in angry red welts from insect bites and the agonizing itch of fungal infections. Yet his mind had to remain crystalline, focused entirely on the mathematical perfection of the shot. He had to suppress the human instinct to rush to panic, to fire wildly at shadows. He existed in a state of hyper-aware meditation, tuning out the sounds of distant artillery and the groans of wounded men to listen for the subtle rustle of leaves or the faint click of a rifle bolt. He was playing a lethal game of chess against opponents who were equally patient and utterly ruthless, but he possessed the superior piece on the board, the magnificent steel and walnut of the mail-order Winchester. It is also important to recognize the skill and tenacity of the Japanese snipers he was hunting. They were not cowards hiding in the trees, they were highly trained soldiers executing a brilliant defensive strategy. They endured the same horrific jungle conditions as the Americans, subsisting on far less food and medicine. They tied themselves into the highest branches, knowing that if they were wounded they would have no way to descend and would simply hang there until they bled to death or starved. They fought with a fatalistic determination, understanding that their ultimate role was to trade their lives for as much American blood as possible. When George peered through his Lyman scope and found the hidden silhouette of a Japanese marksman, he was looking at a man who had already accepted his own death. This mutual understanding between the hunter and the hunted stripped the conflict down to its most primal elements: two men in a jungle relying entirely on their skill, their patience, and the engineering of their weapons to survive. The historical significance of John George's actions extends far beyond the casualty count. He effectively broke the paradigm of infantry engagement that had dominated the early years of the Second World War. The massive industrial mobilization of the United States had produced weapons of incredible volume like the Garand, the Thompson submachine gun, and the Browning automatic rifle. The prevailing philosophy was that the side that could throw the most lead through the air would inevitably win the firefight. But the jungle negated this industrial advantage. The dense vegetation absorbed bullets, and the complex terrain made it impossible to identify targets. George proved that precision could overcome volume. A single carefully calculated shot from a bolt-action rifle was worth 1,000 rounds fired blindly from a machine gun. This realization forced a tactical evolution. It led to the establishment of dedicated sniper schools, the development of specialized match-grade ammunition, and the procurement of high-quality optics. The modern military sniper, a highly trained specialist equipped with a custom-built precision rifle, owes a massive conceptual debt to the young lieutenant who brought a deer rifle to a world war. As the war progressed and the American island hopping campaign pushed closer to the Japanese home islands, the tactics pioneered on Guadalcanal were refined and perfected. American forces encountered increasingly elaborate Japanese defensive networks, deeply dug caves, interconnected bunkers, and brilliantly concealed sniper positions. The reliance on precision marksmanship became absolutely vital to cracking these fortresses. Scout snipers became high-value assets deployed ahead of the main infantry advance to eliminate spotters, officers, and machine gunners. The ethos of the sniper one shot, one kill became a cornerstone of special operations doctrine. But it all started in the muddy, stinking groves west of Point Cruz, where a single man armed with a rifle bought from a catalog decided that he was not going to let his soldiers die at the hands of an invisible enemy. He took the mockery of his superiors, he endured the absolute misery of the jungle environment, and he systematically dismantled the Japanese sniper threat with cold mechanical efficiency. The physical rifle itself, the Winchester Model 70, remains an icon of American firearms history. It represents the pinnacle of 20th-century gunsmithing, an era before mass-produced stamped steel and polymer plastics dominated weapon design. The rifle George carried was a masterpiece of machined steel and carefully fitted wood, a tool built to last generations. The fact that this civilian sporting arm outperformed the purpose-built military weapons of the era is a fascinating commentary on the priorities of military procurement. The Army wanted a rifle that could be manufactured by the millions and handed to farm boys with minimal training. The Garand was perfect for that role. But a sniper is not an average soldier, and a sniper rifle cannot be an average weapon. A sniper requires an instrument that is an extension of their own will, a weapon that eliminates mechanical error and allows the shooter to realize their maximum potential. The mail-order Winchester provided exactly that. It was the perfect synthesis of man and machine operating in an environment of absolute chaos. When analyzing the history of the Second World War, it is easy to become overwhelmed by the macro scale of the conflict. The movements of massive fleets, the strategic bombing of entire cities, the clash of million-man armies on the Eastern Front. But wars are ultimately fought and won by individual men on the ground making desperate decisions in terrifying circumstances. The story of John George and his mail-order rifle is a powerful reminder of this micro-reality. It is a story of ingenuity, courage, and the absolute refusal to accept a fatalistic tactical situation. The officers who mocked him were blind to the specific reality of the battlefield they were fighting on. They were fighting the war they had trained for, while George was fighting the war that actually existed. By stepping outside the rigid boundaries of military regulation, he saved lives and permanently altered the course of tactical doctrine. The 11 Japanese snipers who fell to his heavy hunting bullets over those 4 days were the ultimate proof that true lethality is not measured by the speed of the trigger but by the absolute precision of the strike. The historical archives detail the Battle of Guadalcanal as a turning point in the Pacific War, the moment the United States finally halted the expansion of the Japanese Empire. It was a victory purchased with immense blood and suffering. But within that massive historical framework, the localized action at Point Cruz stands as a legendary feat of individual marksmanship. The image of the young lieutenant sweating in the coral dust, peering through the brilliant glass of his Lyman scope, patiently waiting for the enemy to make a single fatal mistake, is a cinematic encapsulation of the sniper's cold, demanding art. He did not ask for permission to change the rules of engagement, he simply changed them. He proved that the rifleman's true strength lies not in the frantic expenditure of ammunition but in the disciplined, calculated application of a single perfect shot. The mockery faded, the commanding officers fell silent, and the mail-order rifle earned its place in the brutal, unforgiving history of the Pacific Theater. It is a narrative of unyielding factual reality where the mathematics of ballistics and the psychology of the hunter intersected in a humid jungle, resulting in a masterclass of combat effectiveness that resonates through military history to this day.